Hi everyone, welcome to Africa Arise, where we bring you authentic news from across Africa. Let's take a look at this video.
The capital awoke to a nightmare before it even opened its eyes. At precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, when the city should have been wrapped in silence, Burkina Faso stood on the edge of an abyss. A coup attempt, precise, calculated, and engineered for maximum devastation, had slipped into the darkness with the ambition of shattering the nation's destiny in a single blow. And at the center of that blow stood the name the plotters feared most. What security forces uncovered was not chaos born from desperation, but a meticulously layered operation. Industrial grade TNT hidden across critical arteries of the capital and machine guns of foreign make, positioned for a night of irreversible collapse. These were not symbols of intimidation, they were blueprints for national paralysis. The plan was cold, mathematical, and merciless. A strike meant to cripple the state and erase its most symbolic defender from the African stage. But as the city braced for impact, something else unfolded, something the architects of the plot did not anticipate. Between the hour of darkness and the first fracture of dawn, the balance of power shifted in a way that would redefine the nation's path forever. The city was not meant to wake at 3 o'clock. At that hour, Ouagadougou usually lies suspended in a fragile stillness, as if the air itself has paused to listen to its own breathing. But on this night, the capital stirred with an unease that no citizen could sense, yet every stone and corridor seemed to feel. It was the kind of silence that does not comfort, it warns. And somewhere within that silence, an operation designed to fracture the very architecture of national sovereignty was already in motion. The first alert came from a routine patrol navigating a dimly lit sector that had, in recent weeks, become a nervous point on the security map. The officers, seasoned by months of heightened vigilance, noticed a vehicle whose presence was wrong, not because of its shape or color, but because of the way it moved as though it were avoiding the city rather than passing through it. It advanced slowly, almost cautiously, hugging the darkest margins of the road. Even from a distance, the patrol sensed that the rhythm was off. When the officers accelerated to close the gap, the vehicle responded not with the hesitation of an innocent traveler startled by security, but with the calculated precision of someone whose escape routes had been studied long before the night began. In an instant, the quiet streets transformed into a theatre of velocity and risk. Engines roared down narrow roads, dust rose like smoke, shadows fractured under the pulse of headlights. A high speed pursuit surged through arteries of the capital that were never designed to witness such violence. The chase continued for minutes that felt like hours, weaving through residential blocks, unfinished construction sites, and silent industrial corridors whose emptiness only amplified the threat. At one point, the fleeing vehicle cut through an unlit bypass, a route seldom used at night. It was a decision that betrayed planning rather than panic. They knew these roads, they had rehearsed them. But what they did not anticipate was the tenacity of the patrol behind them, driven not merely by duty, but by a growing certainty that something far greater than a routine security breach was unfolding. When the suspects finally lost control and the vehicle skidded into a concrete embankment, the officers approached with discipline sharpened by years of counterinsurgency pressure. What they discovered inside was the first fracture in the darkness. Stacked in the rear compartment were metallic containers labeled as ordinary industrial materials, but their weight, shape, and the cold dread they emanated told another story. A quick field verification removed any doubt. These were high grade TNT cylinders, the kind used not for disruption but for erasure. Within minutes, additional units converged on the scene. What had begun as a suspicious vehicle had become the entry point into a conspiracy of staggering scale. The discovery triggered immediate expansion of the search radius, and as patrols swept through neighboring sectors, more containers were uncovered. Not one, not a handful, but dozens. Each was placed with unsettling intention near infrastructures whose destruction would have plunged the capital into paralysis. There are moments in the life of a nation when danger reveals itself, not through noise, but through precision. And this was such a moment. As the investigation deepened, another revelation sharpened the gravity of the situation. Among the items recovered were several machine guns whose markings raised difficult questions. Their origin was inconsistent with local supply chains and did not match any known inventory associated with regional forces. Analysts would later note that the pattern of engraving and the manufacturing codes pointed to a foreign supply line, though the exact route and actors remained under scrutiny. The weapons were not relics from past conflicts, they were recent, clean, and unmistakably prepared for a specific objective. Some reports suggest that minutes before the pursuit began, a short burst of encrypted communication had been detected by a monitoring station on the outskirts of the capital, although this detail remains without official confirmation. If true, it would imply coordination beyond the immediate environment, a signal, a trigger, perhaps even a warning. But in an operation of this magnitude, every unverified clue becomes a potential doorway into a deeper layer of the plot. By dawn, the scale was undeniable. What the patrol had intercepted was not an isolated attempt to smuggle explosives. It was the opening act of a meticulously designed campaign intended to disorient the nation, overwhelm its defenses, and blind its institutions long enough for a decisive blow to be delivered elsewhere. The explosives were the storm, the weapons were the lightning, the timing was the darkness. The architecture of the night pointed to one conclusion. The city had been seconds away from a rupture that could have rewritten its history. But the most chilling discovery was still ahead, the revelation of what, or rather who, the operation had ultimately been engineered to reach. The fragments uncovered during the first hours after the interception began to reveal a design far more intricate than scattered explosives and an attempted escape. What security analysts confronted was an operation constructed around layers of disruption, each calibrated to trigger the next, like a sequence of falling gates meant to push the nation toward a single, irreversible collapse. To understand the intent behind the placement of industrial-grade TNT across the capital, one must understand the logic of political disintegration. Destabilization first, disorientation second, decisive removal third. The capital of Burkina Faso is not an ordinary urban landscape. Its arteries are woven into the administrative, military, and civic organs of the state. By placing explosives near power substations, transport nodes, communication relays, and dense residential zones, the architects of the operation were not simply aiming for destruction, they were attempting to fracture public confidence. Panic is not merely a feeling in the political realm, it is a weapon. And this plot was forged to deploy it with devastating efficiency. From the moment the first TNT container was discovered, investigators began reconstructing a timeline of the night. Each discovery aligned with a troubling pattern. The explosives were arranged to ignite simultaneous waves of disruption, stretching from the administrative core to the outer rings of the city. Such coordination suggested rehearsed familiarity with the capital's vulnerabilities. The suspects did not intend a single blast to trigger chaos. They intended a symphony of detonations to create the illusion of a city collapsing under its own weight. The logic behind this method has been studied in multiple coup attempts throughout modern political history. When a capital falls into confusion, when lights vanish, when communication grids stutter and the night becomes a field of burning intersections, those who hold the tools of narrative seize the hour. It becomes easier to blame the government, easier to frame collapse as incompetence rather than sabotage, easier to step forward with claims of restoring order. This is the architecture of psychological warfare as much as it is of explosives and weaponry. Yet the second layer of the plot was even more revealing. Investigators determined that the initial detonations were meant to draw security forces outward, pulling attention, manpower, and resources away from the inner administrative zone. Once stretched thin, the protective shield around key institutions would weaken. It was in this carefully engineered vacuum that the decisive stroke was meant to land. The operation, at its core, was not designed simply to terrorize the nation, but to create an opening for the removal of a central figure whose leadership had reshaped the strategic direction of the state. It is within this context that the plot assumed its true dimension. The coordinated deployment of TNT, the foreign marked machine guns, the timing at 3 o'clock all pointed to an objective that extended far beyond sabotage. This was, according to investigators, a carefully structured attempt to erase a political symbol whose presence had recalibrated regional alliances and disturbed networks accustomed to operating without accountability. The technical components of the plot cannot be separated from its strategic heart, an operation designed above all else to eliminate its primary target. In intelligence briefings, analysts referred to it as the central thread that tied all fragments together, the Traore assassination plot. What made this layer particularly alarming was not merely its precision, but the awareness of timing. The hour chosen for the operation spoke volumes. 3 o'clock in the morning is an interval of vulnerability not only for individuals but for institutions. Shift changes, reduced surveillance traffic, diminished human presence across administrative centers. It is an hour when systems rely heavily on automation and when reaction speeds depend on the alertness of a handful of guardians. A theory has been put forward that the perpetrators expected the initial detonations to overwhelm emergency channels, flooding communication lines, and generating contradictory signals that would mask their real advance. While this narrative remains under investigation, it illustrates the degree of planning inferred by the distribution of explosives and weaponry across the capital. The night was mapped to break the nation's rhythm, creating a moment where silence could be exploited as access. As analysts reconstructed the flow of the operation, another troubling realization emerged. The conspirators possessed an understanding of the country's institutional reflexes. They anticipated which units would respond first, which sectors would be sealed, which outposts would be reinforced, and which would thin out under pressure. It is this anticipatory logic, the ability to predict the defensive rhythm of the state, that distinguishes a sophisticated plot from desperate insurgency. The operation was built not on recklessness, but on calculation. And yet, despite this architecture of precision, one element remained absent: the identity of the hand that coordinated it all. Every detail recovered answered one question, but opened another. The explosives explained the scale, the weapons suggested external links, the timing revealed strategic intelligence, but none of these fragments disclosed the origin of the command. That answer, investigators believed, lay in the next layer, the source of the weapons themselves. By the time the sun lifted its first pale arc over the horizon, the investigators had already begun the grimmest part of their task, tracing the weapons. Explosives can tell a story by their placement, but firearms tell a story by their origin. Unlike TNT, which can be industrial, commercial, civilian, or military, machine guns speak through their material accents: the shape of a trigger guard, the alignment of a bolt carrier, the style of engraving, the peculiar rhythm of a serial code. They carry fingerprints of entire manufacturing philosophies, and those fingerprints rarely lie. The weapons seized during the night did not belong to any known national stock. Their serial patterns diverged from regional production, and the metalwork bore the cold precision of facilities that operate far from the Sahel's borders. Analysts working alongside munitions specialists noted that several markings were inconsistent with legal export channels. Such inconsistencies do not automatically imply illicit transfer, but they raise questions that reverberate deeply in a climate already strained by geopolitical realignments. The Sahel is no stranger to weapons crossing borders under the cover of broken trade routes, collapsed states, and opportunistic intermediaries. For more than a decade, the region has been shaped by a tide of arms that spilled from distant conflicts, carried by itinerant networks and mercenary pipelines. But what distinguishes routine smuggling from strategic supply is intent. And the intent behind the weapons recovered in the capital pointed towards an operation that required access far beyond the reach of local actors. Investigators began mapping the potential pathways through which the weapons could have entered the country. Several corridors have historically served as conduits for illicit arms, the trans-Saharan routes stretching from old conflict zones, the coastal entry points where oversight is spread thin, and the porous borders that thread through sparsely monitored terrain. Each of these channels offers opportunities for concealment, yet none alone could explain the appearance of equipment so specifically aligned with a single coordinated operation. Past studies on regional arms flows highlight an uncomfortable truth. The Sahel has often been the final destination for weapons whose journeys begin in places far removed from African soil. These weapons travel through a relay of actors, some political, some criminal, some ideological, until they arrive in the hands of those willing to use them, not for statecraft, but for destabilization. What investigators sought, however, was not the general architecture of these networks, but the immediate link. Who placed these particular weapons into this particular operation? In the wake of the night's events, conversations among analysts, diplomats, and regional observers became more pointed. The timing of the operation, the sophistication of the explosives layout, and the presence of advanced weaponry pointed towards a level of coordination that extended beyond spontaneous insurgent planning. This is not speculation. It is the conclusion drawn from decades of studying the anatomy of subversion. When a plot is built with such meticulous layering explosives, diversion, infiltration, targeted removal, the orchestration often involves actors with access to resources and intelligence infrastructure. However, it is essential to distinguish between inquiry and accusation. Investigators have not attributed responsibility to any external party, nor have they drawn definitive conclusions from the weapon markings. What they have done is identify lines of questioning that stem naturally from the evidence: who supplied the firearms, how they were transported, and why they were delivered with such precision at this moment, of all moments, in the country's political trajectory. The context of the Burkina Faso coup attempt sharpens these questions further. The night's events were not an isolated eruption of violence. They occurred within a broader geopolitical moment in which the balance of influence across the Sahel is undergoing profound transformation. As nations reconfigure alliances, reclaim sovereignty, and seek new partnerships, the region has become a space where competing interests, economic, military, and ideological, collide beneath the surface. Where interests collide, instruments of influence sometimes follow. This does not imply direct authorship. The movements of arms do not always correspond to the movements of states. They can pass through private brokers, rogue actors, defunct militias reactivated for profit, or transnational networks that thrive in the shadows of weakened border systems. The complexity of these interactions is precisely what makes attribution so difficult, and why investigators remain cautious, deliberate, and committed to transparency. In the days following the foiled operation, forensic teams catalogued every component recovered from the suspect's vehicle and from the subsequent searches across the capital. Ballistic analysis, metallurgical testing, and tracing of manufacturing signatures became central to the investigation. Meanwhile, intelligence units expanded their search outward, examining whether the logistical footprint of the operation linked to any known international networks. Official inquiries continue, but the preliminary findings underscore one consistent truth: the weapons did not arrive in the capital by accident. If the explosives were designed to shatter the nation's physical confidence, the weapons were intended to strike at its political heart. They were instruments not merely of destruction, but of strategic elimination. And at the center of their trajectory stood the plot was built to remove the individual whose political assent has redrawn the lines of power across the region. The night had revealed how the weapons arrived. The greater question now was why they were sent. To understand the full magnitude of the night's events, one must examine the figure at the center of the storm, not as an individual, but as a political phenomenon. The plot was not shaped around institutions alone. It was shaped around a person whose ascent has unsettled entrenched dynamics within the Sahel and beyond. In recent years, the regional landscape has been marked by an escalating contest between emerging sovereignty movements and long-standing networks that once operated comfortably within familiar hierarchies. Into this shifting tectonic field stepped Ibrahim Traore, a leader whose rise reconfigured the direction, rhythm, and vocabulary of national authority. His leadership did not emerge quietly. It arrived as a declaration, a recalibration of power away from external dependencies and towards internal mandate. This repositioning placed Burkina Faso at the forefront of a broader continental current that sought dignity over deference and agency over accommodation. Within such a movement, symbolic figures become strategic targets. But for those invested in old structures of influence, the presence of a young, assertive reformer presents both a challenge and a disruption to predictable political cycles. In the months preceding the attempted coup, Burkina Faso had accelerated attempts to restructure its security doctrine, its alliances, and its approach to territorial integrity. This shift was not merely administrative, it was ideological. It affirmed the state's claim to self-determination in a region where external actors have historically shaped outcomes through diplomatic, financial, or security channels. For those seeking to preserve the status quo, the consolidation of autonomous decision-making represents a loss of leverage. For those seeking to reshape the political order from within, it represents an obstacle that must be removed. It is within this context that the motive behind the operation becomes clearer. The strategy of destabilization was not constructed to challenge the government abstractly. It was constructed to produce a vacuum at the very apex of state authority. The scale of explosives deployed, the sophistication of weaponry, and the timing of the operation all indicate that the elimination of the nation's central political symbol was the intended outcome. Removing him, in the eyes of the plotters, would fracture the momentum of institutional reform and return the state to a more malleable equilibrium. But what distinguishes this attempt from previous episodes in the region's turbulent history is the convergence of multiple layers of pressure. The pursuit of sovereignty, the redefinition of alliances, the strengthening of regional partnerships, and the firm rejection of external interference have collectively intensified the political temperature. As these elements combined, the leader at their core became both the embodiment of national aspiration and the focal point of external hostility. And yet, the events of that night revealed something the plotters failed to calculate. The architecture of national loyalty had evolved. Burkina Faso was no longer the same terrain they once understood. Its institutions, its armed forces, and its citizens were no longer peripheral actors. They had become the shield around the figure they sought to remove. The night had shown who was targeted. The dawn would show who stood ready to defend him. When the city shook awake under the weight of an unspoken threat, the institutions of Burkina Faso did not fracture, they converged. What unfolded across the capital in the hours following the interception was not a scramble born of panic, but a synchronized counter-response shaped by years of adaptation to unconventional pressure. The armed forces, the intelligence units, and the civic networks moved with a clarity of purpose that defied the chaos the plotters had anticipated. The military's first action was not to pursue every potential lead, but to seal the city into a defensible grid. Key junctions were reinforced, peripheral routes were placed under surveillance, and strategic corridors were locked down with a discipline that prevented the conspirators from exploiting the confusion they had attempted to engineer. By stabilizing the geography of the capital, the armed forces denied the operation its most essential ingredient, momentum. Simultaneously, the intelligence services activated their deep field channels, contacts woven through neighborhoods, market districts, and transport hubs. These networks, built over time to compensate for the fluid nature of the Sahel's security landscape, began feeding real-time information into a central command structure. Um, Suspicious vehicles, unusual movements, abandoned storage points, and recent arrivals were identified and mapped before any of them could mutate into additional threats. The strength of the response did not come from a single institution. It came from the integration of intelligence across multiple tiers of society. What distinguished the night, however, was the behavior of the citizens. Instead of retreating into silence, communities across the capital stepped forward. Reports flowed from local groups, neighborhood guards, and transport workers who recognized irregularities that otherwise might have escaped detection. Civilian vigilance became a national asset, an organic shield formed not by design but by instinct, rooted in the growing belief that safeguarding sovereignty was no longer the task of institutions alone. This synergy between military command, intelligence insight, and civilian awareness produced a counterforce greater than the sum of its parts. While the initial objective of the plot had been to fragment the nation, the response demonstrated a cohesion that even the most sophisticated conspiracies struggle to overcome. At every turn, the network intended to dismantle national unity encountered a unity stronger than itself. Such cohesion reflects more than operational efficiency. It reflects a shift in the national psyche. The pursuit of sovereign direction has cultivated an environment in which destabilization no longer triggers paralysis, but resistance. The night's events revealed not only the depth of institutional resilience, but the emergence of a public consciousness unwilling to allow its future to be broken in the dark. By the time dawn spread across the capital, the question was no longer whether the nation could withstand the attack. It was what this collective awakening meant for the path ahead, and how the events of a single night would shape the country's long struggle toward dignity and self-determination. The answer would emerge not in the aftermath of the plot, but in the message the nation carried forward. When daylight finally claimed the skyline of the capital, it revealed more than extinguished danger. It revealed a nation transformed by the weight of a night that could have rewritten its destiny. The explosives, the intercepted weapons, the intricate choreography of infiltration, all were pieces of an operation designed not simply to shake the state, but to unseat the very idea of sovereignty that Burkina Faso had been rebuilding with uncommon determination. Yet the dawn did not uncover a broken nation, it uncovered a nation that refused to bow. What emerged in the aftermath was a renewed clarity about the stakes of this moment in history. The night's events were not a random eruption, nor an isolated episode of subversion. They were the sharp edge of a wider contest in which political autonomy, territorial dignity, and national self-respect stand at the center. Attempts to destabilize the country will not fade quickly. They will evolve, shift, and adapt. But so too will the institutions, the armed forces, and the citizens who stood firm when the darkness tested their resolve. In this struggle, the figure at the heart of the nation bears a symbolic weight far beyond the confines of office. The resilience displayed by the people, the coordination of the state, and the refusal of the capital to yield reaffirm an undeniable truth. The leadership of Ibrahim Traore has become inseparable from the country's pursuit of dignity. It is precisely this symbolism that made the Traore assassination plot such a decisive moment, an effort not merely to strike at a person, but at the vision he represents. And yet, as the night proved, the nation now stands as a shield around him. The implications of the foiled attempt echo far beyond the borders. Observers across the region recognize that the attempted Burkina Faso coup was not about seizing a building or toppling a government. It was about derailing a trajectory of self-determination that is gaining momentum across the Sahel. But the nation did not falter. And in its refusal to falter, it has strengthened the very path the plotters hoped to erase. This is why the hours after dawn carried a deeper message. The future is no longer passive. It is claimed, defended, and shaped by a population that understands the cost of silence. And as the nation steps forward, the name of Ibrahim Traore stands not as a target, but as a declaration. Now, more than ever, the world must watch, and those who believe in sovereignty must not simply observe, but stand with this unfolding chapter. If this message resonates with you, let it travel, share it, speak of it, and remain present as the next page of Africa's rising story is written.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more exciting updates from Africa Arise.